No one in the glass towers of Arlington Financial Group ever noticed the janitor. Which was exactly how Daniel Whitaker liked it. At 58 years old, Daniel had built one of the most powerful investment firms in the country from the ground up. Forbes called him a visionary. Business magazines called him ruthless. His competitors called him impossible to beat. But for the past 3 weeks, Daniel Whitaker had been pushing a mop through the marble lobby of his own company. No one recognized him. No one looked twice, and that was the point. Because Daniel Whitaker had begun to suspect something was very wrong inside the company he had spent 30 years building. Numbers had started to feel off, not dramatically wrong, nothing obvious enough to trigger alarms or investigation. But Daniel had learned long ago that the most dangerous corruption didn't scream, it whispered. Small irregularities, department budgets that didn't quite match their performance, charity donations that looked generous on paper but somehow never seemed to reach the communities they were meant for. The board assured him everything was fine, the executives said the same. But Daniel Whitaker had built his fortune by trusting instincts that other people ignored. In reality, he was cleaning bathrooms on the 14th floor of his own headquarters. The disguise wasn't complicated. A gray janitor uniform, thick framed glasses, a carefully grown beard, and posture. Daniel Whitaker had spent decades walking like the most, but power lived in posture. Remove that posture and people stopped seeing you. Now he walked with slightly rounded shoulders, eyes down, invisible. The company badge he wore simply read, Daniel W. Facilities, and just like that, the billionaire CEO had become the lowest-ranking employee in the building. Which meant something fascinating happened. People started showing him who they really were. Executives who spoke proudly about a team culture in meetings suddenly became very different people when they thought no one important was watching. Daniel overheard conversations while emptying trash bins, complaints about employees, quiet discussions about manipulating reports, casual cruelty disguised as corporate humor. It was disappointing, but it wasn't surprising. Power always revealed character. And Daniel had seen plenty of ugly character during his career. But 3 weeks into his experiment, something unexpected happened. Her name was Emily Carter. Daniel noticed her because she was the only person in the building who spoke to him like he was human. The first time it happened, Daniel had been mopping the hallway outside the accounting department. It was late, almost 9 p.m. Most employees had already gone home. Emily stepped out of the elevator carrying a stack of folders nearly as tall as her. She was probably in her mid-20s, brown hair tied in a simple ponytail. No designer clothes like the other employees wore. Just practical slacks, a modest sweater, and comfortable shoes. She nearly tripped over Daniel's mop bucket. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said quickly. Daniel blinked. People usually didn't apologize to janitors. No problem," he said in a quieter voice than his usual confident tone. She smiled, a real smile. "A long day?" Daniel gestured to the empty hallway. "It seems like everyone else already escaped." Emily laughed softly. "Accounting doesn't escape during quarter close." Then something unusual happened. Instead of walking away, she knelt down and helped him move the heavy bucket aside. Most executives in this building wouldn't even hold the elevator door for maintenance staff. But here was an entry-level accountant, helping a janitor move cleaning equipment. Daniel watched her carefully. People revealed their true nature in small moments like that. Over the next week, Daniel began noticing Emily Carter more often. She always arrived early, she always stayed late. But unlike most of the employees grinding overtime, Emily never seemed bitter about it. She worked quietly, efficiently, and every single evening, at exactly 7:30 p.m., she left the office carrying a small envelope. That was when Daniel's curiosity really started. Because Emily Carter did something no one else in the building ever did. She walked past the elevators, past the parking garage, and out the front door, where an old city bus stopped. Daniel had seen executives earning 6 figures complain about taking the subway once. But Emily rode the bus every night. Even stranger, she never seemed unhappy about it. 3 nights later, not closely enough to be noticed, but close enough to understand where she went every evening. The bus ride lasted nearly 40 minutes, from the shining financial district, into older neighborhoods where the buildings were smaller and the streets quiet. Emily stepped off near a small brick building with peeling paint and a faded blue sign. Daniel froze when he read it. St. Mary's Children's Home and Orphanage. Emily walked inside without hesitation. Daniel stayed across the street, watching, waiting. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Finally, curiosity overpowered restraint. Daniel crossed the street. The front door was slightly open, and through the hallway he could hear something unexpected. Laughter. Children's laughter. He stepped inside quietly. The sound led him toward a brightly lit room at the end of the hall. Inside, Emily Carter was sitting on the floor surrounded by nearly a dozen children. They couldn't have been older than 8 or 9. She was helping them with homework. One little boy tugged on her sleeve. Miss Emily, is this right?" Emily leaned over his worksheet patiently. "Almost," she said gently. "You just forgot the last number." The boy grinned. Daniel watched from the hallway, trying to understand what he was seeing. This wasn't volunteer work someone did once a month for a resume. Emily moved like someone who belonged here, like family. Then the director appeared beside Daniel, an older woman with kind eyes and silver hair. "You must be new," she said softly. Daniel turned. "Just visiting," she smiled knowingly. They all come to see Emily eventually." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "All?" "Oh yes," the woman chuckled. "People always want to know why she does it." Does what?" The woman looked genuinely surprised. "You don't know?" She gestured toward the children gathered around Emily. "Emily Carter donates her entire salary to keep this place open." Daniel felt the words hit him like a physical force. "Our entire salary?" The director nodded. For the past 11 months. Daniel stared through the doorway again, at the young accountant sitting cross-legged on the floor helping a little girl spell words. "You mean part of her salary?" The woman shook her head. No," she smiled softly. "All of it." Daniel Whitaker, billionaire founder of Arlington Financial Group, felt something inside him shift. Because in 30 years of business, he had met thousands of wealthy people. Investors, executives, philanthropists who wrote giant checks with their names on buildings. But he had never met anyone who gave away everything they earned. And suddenly, the janitor disguise didn't feel like an experiment anymore. It felt like the beginning of a mystery. Because Daniel Whitaker needed to understand something. Why would a young woman working entry-level accounting give away every dollar she made? And more importantly, why had no one in his company ever noticed? Daniel Whitaker didn't leave the orphanage that night. Not immediately. Instead, he stayed in the quiet hallway, leaning lightly against the wall as he watched the scene unfold inside the classroom. Emily Carter had completely forgotten the outside world existed. She was helping a little girl with reading now, tracing the words slowly with her finger. "Sound it out," Emily encouraged gently. Brave," the girl said suddenly, eyes lighting up. Emily clapped softly. "That's it. See? I told you could do it." The little girl threw her arms around Emily's neck in a spontaneous hug. Daniel noticed something then. Emily closed her eyes for a brief second while hugging the child. Not just kindness, relief. Like this moment meant more to her than it should have. Across the room, 2 boys were arguing over a math worksheet. Emily moved over instantly, sitting between them. "No battles over fractions," she said playfully. Fractions are already confusing enough." Emily Carter wasn't volunteering. She was present, fully, completely present. And Daniel couldn't stop thinking about what the director had said. She gives away her entire salary. That didn't make sense. Even the wealthiest philanthropists didn't give everything. Humans protected themselves first. That was basic instinct. But Emily Carter clearly hadn't, which meant one of 2 things. Either she was incredibly naive, or there was a story behind it. Eventually the children began heading toward their dorm rooms. Emily helped them gather their backpacks and books. "A good night, Miss Emily," one girl called. "A good night, Sophie," Emily replied warmly. Another child tugged her sleeve. "We'll come back tomorrow, right?" "Of course I will," she promised. "A promise?" Emily held out her pinky finger. "A promise." Daniel noticed something else then. Every child hugged her goodbye. Every single one. Not like volunteers. Like family. After the last child disappeared down the hallway, Emily stood up and stretched slightly. The director approached her. "You worked them hard tonight?" she teased. Emily smiled. "Oh, worked me hard. Same time tomorrow?" Emily nodded. "Always." Then the director noticed Daniel standing near the hallway entrance. "Oh," she said surprised. "You're still here." Emily turned. For a moment she looked confused. Then she recognized him. "The janitor from Arlington Financial," she said. Daniel nodded casually. Yeah, Daniel. Her expression brightened. You followed the bus. Daniel shrugged slightly. A curiosity. Emily laughed softly. Well, you found the least glamorous place in the city. Daniel glanced around the worn hallway. Peeling paint. Yet it felt warmer than most corporate offices he'd ever stepped into. It doesn't seem that way, he replied. Emily hesitated for a moment. Then she walked over. You shouldn't tell anyone at work you saw me here. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Why not? She gave a small shrug. People at Arlington like neat stories. Things that make sense. And this doesn't? Emily shook her head. An accountant making entry-level salary giving everything away? She smiled faintly. They think I was either lying or crazy. Emily tilted her head. Maybe both. The director chuckled. Emily doesn't tell the story easily. Daniel turned to her. But there is a story. The older woman nodded slowly. A long one, Emily sighed. You don't have to. It's all right, the director interrupted gently. She looked at Daniel. You see this building? Daniel nodded. It used to house 50 children. Emily looked down at the floor. And now we're down to 14. Daniel frowned. Funding disappeared, the director explained. A donation slowed. Grants dried up. She gestured toward the aging walls. Maintaining a place like this costs more than most people realize. Daniel had a rough idea. Insurance, food, clothing, utilities, education. The numbers added up quickly. So Emily stepped in. Daniel said quietly. The director smiled softly. Yes. Emily rubbed the back of her neck awkwardly. It wasn't like that. Daniel looked at her. Then what was it like? Emily hesitated. For a moment Daniel thought she might refuse to answer. Then she took a slow breath. Why grew up here? The words landed softly in the quiet hallway. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. You were an orphan, Emily nodded. Since I was 5. She leaned lightly against the wall. This place raised me. Daniel glanced around again. The worn floors, the patched walls, the small dorm rooms. Suddenly the building felt different. Less like a struggling charity. More like a home. Emily continued quietly. The director here, Mrs. Alvarez, she's the reason I went to college. Mrs. Alvarez smiled modestly. She worked 3 jobs to keep this place open when I was a kid. Daniel frowned. And now it's struggling again. Emily nodded. Last year we almost closed. Daniel looked at Mrs. Alvarez. How close? The woman hesitated. 2 weeks. Daniel blinked. That's it? She nodded. We had food for 14 days. Emily's voice grew quieter. I was 3 months into my job at Arlington. Daniel's mind was already calculating. Entry-level accounting salary. Maybe $45,000 a year. After taxes, less? You gave them everything, Daniel said. Emily nodded. At first it was temporary. She looked toward the dorm hallway. Just until we found other donors. Daniel already knew the answer. And you didn't. Emily shook her head slowly. So the temporary solution became permanent. She gave a small smile. 11 months now. Daniel studied her face. There was no regret there, no bitterness, just calm acceptance, which somehow made it even more shocking. But how do you live? Daniel asked finally. Emily shrugged. I rent a tiny room nearby. Food? She smiled faintly. I'm very good at budgeting. Mrs. Alvarez crossed her arms. She eats dinner here most nights. Emily shot her a playful look. You make it sound worse than it is. Daniel felt something unexpected stir inside him. Respect. Not the polite kind people offered at corporate events, the deep kind, earned through sacrifice. Because the truth was, Daniel Whitaker had donated millions in his lifetime. But he had never given up comfort, never sacrificed security, never risked his own survival. Emily Carter had. Quietly, without recognition. Without anyone at her own company even noticing. Daniel glanced at his watch. It was nearly midnight. You should head home, Emily said. Daniel nodded slowly. But as he walked toward the door, a thought formed in his mind. A question that wouldn't go away. If someone like Emily Carter existed inside his company, how many others had gone unnoticed? How many good people had his executives overlooked while chasing profit margins? And more importantly, what would happen if the board ever discovered that one of their employees was giving away her entire paycheck? Daniel Whitaker had seen how corporations treated inefficiency, even when that inefficiency came from kindness. He stepped outside into the cool night air and made a quiet decision. Tomorrow, the janitor would start asking questions. Because something told him Emily Carter's sacrifice was about to collide with the cold logic of corporate numbers. And when it did, someone in that glass tower was going to make a terrible mistake. Daniel Whitaker barely slept that night. For nearly 30 years, he had trusted a simple philosophy when it came to business and people. Words meant nothing. Anyone could say the right thing. Anyone could perform kindness when someone important was watching. But true character only revealed itself under pressure. It showed itself when there was something to gain, or something to lose. And as Daniel lay awake in his penthouse apartment, staring at the ceiling, one thought kept circling his mind. Emily Carter gives away everything she earns. It sounded noble. But Daniel Whitaker had seen too much of the world to accept things at face value. Sometimes generosity came with hidden motives. Sometimes sacrifice masked poor judgment. And sometimes people built their identities around being selfless because they were running from something else. So Daniel decided to find out the truth, not by asking questions, but by watching what Emily Carter did when the situation became difficult. The next morning, Daniel arrived at Arlington Financial before anyone else. That wasn't unusual for the janitorial staff. He pushed his cleaning cart into the quiet marble lobby and began wiping down the front desk. The security guard nodded at him lazily. "A morning, Daniel. A morning." By 8:15 a.m., the building had begun filling with employees. Expensive suits, coffee cups, fast footsteps, phones already pressed against ears. Daniel watched them all carefully. But he was waiting for one person. At exactly 8:27 a.m., Emily Carter walked through the glass doors. Right on schedule, she wore the same simple style she always did. No designer bag. No flashy jewelry, just a canvas tote filled with files. Daniel noticed something else. She stopped at the lobby coffee stand, but instead of ordering anything for herself, she bought 2 cups. One she handed to the security guard. "A morning, Carl," she said cheerfully. The guard blinked in surprise. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she replied with a smile. "But Mondays are rough." Carl chuckled. "You're the only person in this building who notices that." Emily shrugged. "As someone should." Then she headed toward the elevators. Daniel watched quietly. Test number 1 had already answered itself. Kindness when no one important was watching. That mattered, but it wasn't enough. Daniel needed to see how she behaved when things went wrong. Late that afternoon, Daniel created the first situation. Nothing dramatic, just a small inconvenience. The accounting department's printer jammed constantly. Daniel had noticed that during his cleaning rounds, so he made a small adjustment. He removed a tiny plastic roller from inside the printer, just enough to guarantee that the machine would fail during heavy use. Then he waited. At 4:42 p.m., the first frustrated voice echoed through the accounting office. "Are you kidding me?" Another employee groaned. "The printer's dead again." Daniel continued mopping the hallway outside. Inside, he could hear the growing irritation. "Oh, why do we even have maintenance if this thing never works? Oh, where's facilities?" A few minutes later, Emily stepped out into the hallway. She spotted Daniel immediately. "Hey Daniel," she said politely. "Sorry to bother you." He leaned on the mop. "What's up?" "Our printer's having another meltdown." Daniel scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Let me take a look." Inside the office, several employees looked irritated. One man muttered loudly. Finally, Emily shot him a quick look. Then she turned back to Daniel. "You take your time," she said quietly. "You no rush." Daniel knelt beside the machine. He already knew exactly what was wrong. But instead of fixing it immediately, he pretended to inspect several panels. Emily crouched beside him. Can I help?" Daniel glanced up. "You know how printers work?" She laughed. No, but I can hold tools." "All right." For the next 10 minutes, Emily sat on the floor beside him, handing him tools while he pretended to diagnose the issue. None of the other employees offered help. Most had already gone back to their desks complaining, but Emily stayed. Eventually Daniel replaced the roller and closed the machine. "Try it now." Emily hit the print button. The machine whirred back to life. She clapped her hands once. "You're a hero," Daniel chuckled. "Hardly. But something interesting happened then." She pulled out a small brown paper bag. "Cookie?" she asked. Daniel blinked. "You brought cookies to work?" Mrs. Alvarez baked them," she explained. "The kids helped." Daniel took one. It was warm. "Homemade." Thank you," he said. Emily shrugged casually. "You fixed our printer, fair trade." Then she returned to her desk, as if the moment meant nothing. but Daniel Whitaker knew it meant something, because kindness had a pattern. And Emily Carter showed that pattern again and again. Still, the real test was coming. 2 days later, Daniel arranged something far more serious. Using his private access to the company systems, he instructed the finance department to issue a temporary payroll delay for the accounting team. Nothing permanent, just a bureaucratic processing error. Employees began checking their banking apps. Within minutes, complaints spread through the office. My paycheck isn't here. Mine either. What is going on? The accounting floor buzzed with irritation. One employee stormed toward the manager's office. This better get fixed. Daniel watched quietly from the hallway. Emily sat at her desk reviewing spreadsheets. One of her coworkers leaned over. You see this payroll mess? Emily nodded. Yeah, the coworker groaned. I had rent scheduled today. Emily frowned sympathetically. The coworker looked around nervously. I might have to borrow money from someone? Emily paused. Then she opened her bag. She pulled out her wallet. How much do you need? The coworker stared. You'd lend me money, Emily nodded. Of course, but what if payroll doesn't get fixed? Emily smiled gently. Then we'll figure it out Monday. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest again, because he knew something the others didn't. Emily Carter's bank account had almost nothing in it. Every paycheck disappeared into the orphanage fund, which meant the money she was offering was probably the last of it. That evening, Daniel followed her again, back to St. Mary's. Emily handed Mrs. Alvarez an envelope. Daniel knew what was inside. Her salary, every dollar of it. The director looked hesitant. You don't have to keep doing this. Emily smiled softly. I know. Mrs. Alvarez studied her carefully. You could build a life for yourself. Emily glanced toward the dorm hallway where the children slept. I am. Daniel stood outside the doorway in silence. And for the first time since starting his experiment, he felt something he hadn't expected. Not curiosity, not suspicion, admiration. But admiration came with responsibility. Because Daniel Whitaker was starting to realize something troubling. Emily Carter was one of the best people in his entire company. And no one in power even knew she existed. Which meant someone in Arlington Financial had already failed. And if Daniel didn't intervene soon, someone might make a decision that would destroy the quiet good Emily Carter was doing. What Daniel didn't realize yet was that decision had already begun forming in the executive offices upstairs. And Emily Carter was about to become a problem. The first mistake wasn't Emily Carter's. It was inevitable. In a company as large as Arlington Financial Group, nothing stayed hidden forever. That is, not transactions, not behavior, and certainly not anomalies in payroll data. It started in the most ordinary way possible. A quarterly audit, a routine review of departmental expenses, headcount efficiency, and a non-essential financial leakage. That was the phrase the executives used. Non-essential financial leakage. Daniel Whitaker had heard it dozens of times before, but this time, something in the data caught attention. A junior analyst frowned at her screen. That can't be right. Her supervisor leaned over. What? Oh, this employee, she said, pointing. Ms. Emily Carter, accounting department. What about her? The analyst hesitated. She's been consistently redirecting nearly 100% of her net pay into external accounts. The room went quiet. That wasn't normal. Even in a company full of aggressive investors and high earners, people diversified investments. But 100% transfer out of payroll? That was not financial planning, that was disappearance. Within hours, the data reached middle management, then senior management, then the executive floor, and finally, the board. By the time Daniel Whitaker heard about it, he was standing in the hallway outside the executive conference room, pushing his mop bucket slowly across the polished floor. Inside, voices were already rising. This is a compliance risk. We cannot have employees diverting full compensation without disclosure. Could she laundering money, or hiding income? A sharp voice cut through the room. Or she's unstable. That voice belonged to Richard Hulden, Chief Operating Officer. Daniel recognized him instantly. Richard always spoke like numbers were moral judgments. If something didn't maximize output, Richard called it failure. The meeting continued. We need to terminate her employment immediately, another executive said. She's a liability. She's been here less than a year and is already manipulating payroll behavior. Richard tapped the table. Let's be clear, he said. We are not a charity organization. We are a financial institution. Behavior like this creates reputational risk. A pause. Then another voice added coldly, if this gets out, investors will question our internal controls. The room agreed quickly, too quickly. Daniel stood just outside the door, listening, and for the first time since starting his disguise, he felt something shift, not curiosity anymore, concern, because none of them had asked a single question about why she was doing it. Only whether she could be controlled. The next morning, Emily Carter was called into her car. She arrived exactly on time, same simple outfit, same calm expression, but Daniel noticed something different. Her shoulders were slightly tighter, not fear, awareness. Inside the HR office, 3 people sat waiting, 1 HR manager, 1 legal advisor, and Richard Halden himself. Emily sat down across from them. Was something wrong? She asked politely. Richard didn't waste time. We've reviewed your financial activity. Emily blinked. The activity? The HR manager slid a folder across the table. Your payroll records show nearly all of your income is being transferred externally. Emily nodded slowly. Yes. Silence. Richard leaned forward. Do you understand how that looks? Emily tilted her head slightly. I'm not sure what you mean. It looks, Richard said sharply, like either financial irresponsibility or concealed activity. Emily frowned. I'm not hiding anything. Richard's eyes narrowed. Then explained, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she seemed unsure if she was allowed to say it. Finally she spoke. There's an orphanage. The HR manager blinked. An orphanage? Yes, Emily said softly. St. Mary's Children's Home. Richard exhaled impatiently. Why support them? The legal advisor frowned. With your entire salary? Yes. Another silence, this one heavier. Richard leaned back in his chair. That's not sustainable. Emily looked at him. It has been for almost a year. Richard shook his head. You're not hearing me. This creates risk for the company. Emily's expression changed slightly. A risk? Richard gestured toward the folder. If you suddenly decide you can't meet basic living requirements, and you're relying on unstable finances, it affects your performance. Emily stared at him for a moment. Then she asked quietly, have I missed any deadlines? The room went still. Richard paused. No. Have I made errors in my work? Another pause. Emily nodded slightly. Then I don't understand the problem. Richard's jaw tightened. The problem, he said coldly, is that this is irrational behavior. Emily blinked. Irrational? Richard stood now. You are giving away your entire income while working in a high-pressure financial environment. That is not responsible. That is not stable. Emily looked down for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. Those children don't have anyone else. Richard sighed sharply. That is not your responsibility. Emily looked up. Whose is it then? No one answered. Outside the room, Daniel Whitaker had stopped moving entirely. The mop handle rested in his hand, but he wasn't cleaning anymore. He was listening. Because in that moment, he realized something important. The executives weren't angry because Emily had done something wrong. They were angry because they couldn't categorize it. It didn't fit into spreadsheets. It didn't fit into risk models. It didn't fit into profit structures. And anything that didn't fit was labeled dangerous. Inside the HR room, Richard delivered the final decision. Emily Carter, he said formally, effective immediately, your employment is under review pending termination. Emily blinked. A termination? A yes. The HR manager looked uncomfortable but didn't speak. Richard continued. This is not personal, it is procedural. Your financial behavior violates internal stability guidelines. Emily's hands tightened slightly on her lap. For the first time, a crack appeared in her calm. Can I ask something? She said quietly. Richard nodded impatiently. Yes. Emily hesitated. Did I do something wrong? Richard didn't hesitate. Yes. That answer landed harder than anything else in the room. Emily sat there for a moment processing it. Then she asked one more question. Oh, because I help children? Richard exhaled sharply. Because you created financial unpredictability. Emily nodded slowly. Then she stood up. No anger, no protest, just acceptance. Okay, she said quietly, and she turned to leave. That evening Daniel Whitaker followed her again. He already knew where she was going. St. Mary's Children's Home. The children greeted her like nothing had changed. Because for them, nothing had. But Daniel noticed Emily wasn't smiling the same way. She still helped with homework. She still comforted the youngest children. She still sat on the floor and laughed softly when they joked. But something underneath had shifted. A quiet heaviness. After the children went to bed, Mrs. Alvarez approached her. "You look tired," she said gently. Emily nodded. "Well, I had a meeting at work." The director studied her carefully. "A trouble?" Emily hesitated, then she nodded again. "They might fire me." Mrs. Alvarez sighed. "I'm sorry." Emily shook her head. "It's okay." The director frowned. "How is that okay?" "Because they don't know what's happening upstairs in those offices," she said softly. They just know they have a place to sleep." A pause. Then she added, "That matters more." Outside the doorway, Daniel Whitaker stood in silence. The city lights flickered in the distance, and for the first time since this experiment began, he felt something heavier than suspicion. Because he now understood the direction this was heading. The executives weren't going to stop at a warning. They were going to remove her, and they had no idea that in doing so, they were about to make a mistake that would expose something far bigger than Emily Carter's salary. Daniel tightened his grip on the mop handle. Because tomorrow, he would no longer be just watching. He would have to decide what kind of company he was really running, and whether anyone inside Arlington Financial Group had ever truly understood what a value meant at all. The decision came quietly, not in a boardroom, not in an emergency meeting, but in the early hours of the morning, when Arlington Financial Group was still half asleep beneath the glow of its glass towers. Daniel Whitaker stood alone in the executive office, still wearing the janitor uniform, still holding the mop he no longer needed. For weeks, he had watched, he had tested, he had listened, and he had seen exactly what kind of company his empire had become when no one was looking at the top. And now, Emily Carter was about to be removed from it. Not because she failed, but because she refused to stop caring. Daniel set the mop against the wall. Then he pressed a single button on the intercom. "Call an emergency executive meeting," he said calmly. There was a pause on the other end. Sir, who is this?" A beat of silence. Then Daniel replied, "Tell them Daniel Whitaker is in the building." Within 20 minutes, the entire executive floor was in chaos. Richard Halden arrived first, followed by HR. Then legal. Then the remaining board members who were still in the city. Whispers filled the glass conference room. Daniel Whitaker is abroad. Phil's supposed to be on retreat. Is this a security issue? The doors opened, and Daniel walked in. No longer moving like a janitor. No longer hiding his posture. The room fell silent instantly. Richard's face tightened. "Mr. Whitaker?" He simply looked around the table. "I've spent the last several weeks working in this building." Confusion spread immediately. Richard forced a smile. "I'm sorry, working?" Daniel nodded. "As a janitor." The silence that followed wasn't confusion anymore. It was disbelief. One board member actually laughed nervously. "I'm sorry, is this a metaphor?" Daniel turned his eyes toward him. "No." The room went still again. Then Daniel placed a file on the table. "I've reviewed your decisions regarding Emily Carter." Daniel didn't react. "A compliance protocol," he repeated quietly. Then he looked up. "You tried to fire one of the most ethically consistent employees in this company." Richard straightened. "She violated financial stability guidelines." Daniel's voice stayed calm. "She donated her entire salary to keep a children's home alive." A pause. "And you called that instability?" No one spoke. Because suddenly the words sounded different in this room. Heavier. Wrong. Richard tried again. "With respect, sir, companies cannot function based on emotional decision." Daniel finally looked directly at him. "Then explain to me how this company functioned for the past year while she was the only one ensuring 14 children had food." Richard hesitated. Daniel cut him off. "You never asked why," he said quietly. "Not once." "You saw numbers," Daniel continued. "And you labeled compassion as risk." The HR manager looked down. The legal advisor didn't speak. Richard tried one last time. "She still created financial unpredictability." Daniel's tone sharpened slightly. "No." The word landed like a final verdict. "Emily Carter created stability in a place you failed to notice existed." Daniel turned toward the glass wall overlooking the city. For a moment, he was quiet. Then he spoke again. "When I built this company, I thought success meant efficiency." He paused. "I thought it meant optimizing everything down to the last dollar." He turned back to them. But I forgot something. A beat. Efficiency without humanity is just extraction." The room stayed silent. Daniel opened another folder. "Effective immediately," he said. Emily Carter will not be terminated. Richard's expression tightened. Sir, that decision goes against procedure, Daniel interrupted. Then change the procedure. That shut the room down completely. Later that afternoon, Emily Carter was called back into the building. She arrived confused, still carrying her worn tote bag, still expecting paperwork, but when she entered the conference room, everything stopped. Richard was there, the HR manager, legal counsel, and at the head of the table, Daniel Whitaker. Emily froze slightly. Daniel, he nodded. Yes, Richard cleared his throat. This is highly irregular. Daniel raised a hand. Enough. Then he looked at Emily, and for the first time, he didn't hide anything. No one here understood what you were doing, he said quietly. Emily looked uncertain. I was just, you were supporting 14 children, Daniel said. A pause. While this company called it a liability, Emily's eyes lowered slightly. I didn't want trouble. Daniel shook his head. You didn't create trouble, he said. You created something this company forgot how to measure. He stepped forward. Integrity. Silence filled the room. Then Daniel continued. I made a mistake. That got everyone's attention. Even Emily looked up. You assumed I knew everything happening inside my company, he said. I didn't. He looked at her directly. But I knew enough to understand this. We almost lost someone who represents everything this company should value. Emily blinked. I don't understand. Daniel nodded slightly. I was the janitor you kept helping. Her eyes widened. A breath caught in her throat. What? Daniel removed his glasses. Then slowly he straightened fully. The disguise fell away completely, and the room finally understood. Emily stepped back slightly. You were... yes, Daniel said calmly. A long silence followed. Then Emily's voice came quietly. All that time? Daniel nodded. I needed to understand who you were. I didn't test you, he said. I confirmed what I hoped was true. A pause. You are exactly who this company should be built around. Richard looked visibly uncomfortable. This is becoming emotional rather than procedural. Daniel turned slowly. No, he said. This is what leadership looks like when it finally pays attention. Silence. Then Daniel made the final decision. Emily Carter is no longer an accounting employee. Emily froze. Richard looked relieved. Daniel continued. She is being promoted. Emily blinked. Promoted, Daniel nodded. To head of corporate social responsibility and community investment. A pause. You will design the programs this company should have had years ago. Emily stood still. I don't know what to say. Daniel's expression softened slightly. I say yes. A beat. Emily looked down, then she looked back up. Yes, that evening Emily returned to St. Mary's Children's Home, but this time, she wasn't alone. Daniel came with her. So did members of the board. And for the first time the children saw something unusual. People in suits, standing in their hallway, awkward, quiet, not knowing how to behave in a place like this. Emily knelt down beside the youngest child. We're going to make sure you always have a home here, she said softly.
Roost.
The child hugged her instantly. Daniel watched silently, and something inside him settled. Not profit, not strategy, but something far rarer in his world. Alignment. Weeks later, the changes inside Arlington Financial Group became impossible to ignore. Corporate donations increased, but with direct transparency. Employees were encouraged, not discouraged, to support community work. And Emily Carter's name stopped being associated with a risk. It became associated with something else entirely. Trust. One evening long after the office had emptied, Daniel stood by the window of his penthouse. Emily joined him quietly. You didn't have to do all of this, she said. Daniel looked out at the city lights. Yes, he replied. I did. She smiled slightly. Why? Daniel paused for a long moment. Then he said simply, because I spent too long thinking success was about building something big. A beat. But I finally understand something else. He looked at her. It's about building something that means something. Emily nodded slowly. I think the kids would agree with you. Daniel gave a faint smile. I think they already taught me that. And somewhere far below the glass towers and corporate meetings, a small orphanage stayed open another year. Because one person refused to stop caring, and one man finally decided to start noticing.